Okay.
Okay.
You're good to go, Joel.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Joel Grossman, and along with Ethan Pack, who you can see on the screen, we're going to be discussing a book by Dorit Rabinyan called All the Rivers. And before I start talking about All the Rivers, I want to just ask how many people may remember Mrs. Fields cookies. Anybody remember Mrs. Fields cookies? Okay. So if you remember Mrs. Fields cookies, you may remember that they didn't sell them in the supermarket next to the Oreos. Mrs. Fields had stores in lots of shopping malls, and she had absolutely delicious, very large chocolate chip cookies. And the best thing about Mrs. Fields cookies is that when you went to the store on the front counter, there was a big bowl full of pieces of one of the cookies, and they were free samples. And you could just take a free sample of this delicious chocolate chip cookie. And so our main goal tonight, Ethan and I, we will be those broken off pieces of Mrs. Fields cookies. We are free samples tonight. We want to give you some understanding of the wonderful Israeli writer Dorit Rabinyan and talk about her best known book. And Ethan will explain why that's her best known book when he talks a little bit later. Because what we really want to do is encourage everyone to come to the first ever Baruch Link Scholar in Residence weekend, which is going to take place beginning on October 28th, a little more than a month from now and after all of the Chagim. So we're going to give you a free sample, a little taste of what the writing of Dorit is like. But of course, for the weekend, it won't be Ethan and me speaking. It'll be Dorit herself talking about her writing, talking about literature, especially Israeli literature in general. And I feel there's nothing like the real thing. You could listen to a movie critic talk about what a great actress Meryl Streep is, but how about if you had to see Meryl Streep in person explaining how she knows how to act? So that's what we're going to have. So I hope you enjoy our preview tonight, but please, everyone, we really want you to make sure that you sign up for the weekend. I believe in the chat, Terry Cohen link has put in the way to sign up. It's the Temple Beth Ham website, tbala.org/link a scholar. And I think you probably went there just to sign up for this program. So that's our biggest goal tonight, is to get people to think about this book, think about Dorit Rabinyan and her writing, and come to the weekend, which is coming up, as I said, October 28th. So now I'd like to just say a little bit about myself and ask Ethan to say a little about himself, and then we'll start talking about the book. As many of you know, I've been a lawyer for about 40 years, but before that, some people don't know, I was an English major in college, and I went to a graduate program in English at UC Santa Barbara, where I was teaching freshman English for several years and working on a PhD in English, which to my mother's great dismay, I never finished. So I never became Dr. Grossman, but I have always maintained a great interest in literature and also a great interest, of course, in Israel. And so Israeli literature is something that's very, very special to me. And I am also a member of the Baruch Link Scholar in Residence Committee, as is Ethan, and it's a great honor to be representative of my wonderful friend Baruch, and pitch this weekend, which I think will be a wonderful way to enjoy learning a lot about Hebrew literature, but also enjoy the idea of memorializing Baruch. So that's me. Ethan, why don't you introduce yourself and what you do?
All right. Thank you very much, Joel. I'm glad you put in the plug for the ABD. That's when it's academia for when Joel made a probably smart long-term life choice. And I made a different choice. So I teach literature, Israeli and Middle Eastern literature, Arabic literature at UCLA. I'm a research fellow with the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. And I'm also, as Jill mentioned, on the committee, and very honored to be participating in this and to continue Baruch Link's legacy. I remember just as kind of anonymous, like a chayal boded, like a lone soldier, but that's what I was in my grad school years, to go to Beth for Yom Kippur. I didn't have any family here. The Grossmans welcomed me, and I would learn so much from Baruch and his teachings then. And so this is a great way to continue the teaching. And I think I'll toss it back to you, Joel, for the next part.
Okay, well, what I wanted to do also is begin with you, Ethan, talking about Dorit's writing in general, putting her in the context of other Israeli writers, maybe some that a lot of us know, such as Amos Oz from an earlier generation, and also talk a little bit about a little controversy involving this novel.
Okay, yeah, sure. So you'll all get to hopefully hear Dorit speak at length, and I'll leave her take on all this to her, but I'm going to try to situate her a little bit within, like Joel said, the context of Israeli literature of the present and in the recent past. And so many American Jews are familiar with these names like Amos Oz and David Grossman, who were, they came of age in the 60s and 70s. They were called the new wave of Hebrew fiction. And they had a public stature for Oz and A.B. Hoshua, both of whom passed away in recent years. It was a public stature akin to a politician, or, our biggest celebrities here. I don't know how to compare it. And there was a great deal of gravity that was attached to their writing, both their fiction, and also they would write nonfiction. They would write op-eds and express political opinions in the public square, you could say. The generation that's come after them, so let's say Israeli writers who are currently, say, in their 40s or 50s, who came of age from the first Intifada through the Oslo process and so on, among them Dorit Rabinyan, there has not been the same stature accorded to any one or even any three novelists like Oz, Grossman, Yehoshua. And that sort of is what makes what happened with Rabinyan even more interesting, because in many ways, the literary space, while still very important in Israel, much more important than it is here in the US, the literary space has begun to sort of take on competition for people's attention from television and film. And interestingly, this novel is being adapted for, Gal Gadot, the Israeli actress, has optioned this book to make into a film, but we'll have to wait for that. So in the meantime, I would say like two or three trends that were going in Israeli literature leading into the publication of this book. One, you had a lot of Israelis writing from abroad. So this book is set in New York City, in Manhattan for the first 2/3 of it, where Dorit Rabinyan lived, and she's very clear that it's based on her personal experience living there, and very evocative of the kind of Israelis in New York, which we can talk about more. But this really, throughout the 2010s, I would say a lot of the prominent Israeli novels were being written and depicting Israelis traveling in South America, Israelis living in Germany or London. And this book, I think, was initially published, sort of it fit into that general trend that in many ways mirrored what young Israelis had been doing since probably the 90s, much more living abroad internationally. One critic called it the new Israeli as the old Jew, like the wandering Jew. Now there's the wandering Israeli. Secondly, there was a great number of books, 2013, 14, 15, that really took an interest in what's going on in the West Bank, like what's going on over there. Unlike Grossman and a lot of Israelis who grew up pre-Oslo, when there was open traffic between Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, a lot of these writers, unless they had served there during their military service, had never been to the West Bank. And so Dorit writes about having grown up in Kfar Saba, which is, a 5-minute drive to Qalqilia, a Palestinian town, but never having been there, of course, with the separation wall and everything. And that's where I should also mention the Hebrew title of the book is Gader Chaya, which means like living border. Gader is a really fruitful word. It's border, it's boundary, it's barrier, it's fence, it's what's used to describe the barrier in the West Bank. And so it's like this living border is how it's called in Hebrew. In English, they changed it. And so now the controversy. So the book is published in the summer of 2014. It gets pretty good reviews. It's her first book since she'd written a few books in her when she was very young, in her 20s, and then she took about 15 years off of writing fiction until this came out. And in 2015, there was a request made by an association of principals and high school teachers to add the book to the Israeli high school curriculum so that it would be a book that you can read for the Bagrut, the matriculation exams. And it was approved by the education ministry at first, but then Naftali Bennett, who at the time was the education minister, now was recently the prime minister, Naftali Bennett basically overruled the sort of internal committees of the education ministry and banned the book from being taught, citing that the inter-ethnic, inter-religious love affair between the main characters would encourage assimilation, that young people sort of wouldn't be able to handle that he didn't like the way it depicted Israeli soldiers. And that, from a commercial standpoint, was the best thing that could have happened to the book, because within a week, the book went to the top of the bestseller list and everyone wanted to read it. What's this thing that's been banned? And why has it been banned? And so it is still banned. Like one kind of anecdotal tidbit, and then I'll wrap this story up, but about a week after the ban, Yitzhak Bougie Herzog, who is now the president of Israel, at the time he was the head of the Labor Party, and he bought a bunch of books for high school in Sderot and donated them sort of as a kind of a protest. Like he said, "Are the people of the book afraid of books?" And so it was a very, for many Israeli writers, whether they liked the book on a literary level or not, kind of became secondary to just the fact of this being a sort of unprecedented development. So on the one hand, and so Dorit can talk at length about how it felt and the publicity and everything that ensued from there. So I think that kind of sets her up and sets the book up. And from there, I think, Julie, you wanted to share it, I believe.
Yes. Yes, thanks very much, Ethan. And well, for those who don't know her, just to let you know, the lovely woman sitting with me is my wife, Fran. So for those who haven't read the book or don't know much about the book, I just want to give a very brief summary. It is a love story between an Israeli woman and a Palestinian man. They meet in New York. They are, oh, there it is, all the rivers. They meet in New York. They have no connection at all before they both get to New York, and they kind of bump into each other by accident at a coffee shop, and pretty soon they become lovers. And so the book is definitely a love story, and a lot of it is very moving. It's a lovely love story, but the book also is very, very political, and not throughout the book, but in certain places. So it's a wonderful thing. I was wondering why the ministry banned it from high schools, and certainly one reason, as Ethan just said, would be don't want to encourage Israelis to become involved romantically with Palestinians. It's also a fair amount of sex in the book, so I don't know if that's considered improper for high school students. I wouldn't necessarily think so. But I think it's especially interesting in the America that we are living in right now, that we are hearing about all sorts of school districts banning books. And so the whole subject of book banning is really of great interest and great concern, I think, to all of us. And the fact that this book wasn't banned exactly, and as Ethan mentioned, went to the top of the bestseller list. But it certainly was banned in high school, and I think that when Dorit first sent our committee some potential topics, one of them was the Prime Minister banned my book, and that was the time when Naftali Bennett was the Prime Minister of Israel, and he had been the Education Minister at the time. So what I wanted to do is spend a few minutes, and I hope that you will not view this as a big spoiler. So here's a spoiler alert. You can go out of the room for 5 minutes, but I'm going to focus on one scene in the book, which is probably the most political scene, and it happens right in the middle of the book. So the Israeli woman who is the narrator of the book is named Liat, and her Palestinian boyfriend is named Hilmi. And they have a few discussions from time to time about who's right, the Israelis or the Palestinians. Should there be a two-state solution? Should there be one state? From time to time, they get into this, and then they realize if they keep going this way, maybe their romance will be destroyed. So they don't go too far. But in this one passage that I'm going to talk about, Hilmi's brother comes into town. Hilmi's brother, Wasim, lives in Berlin, and he comes to visit in New York. And they go out to eat at a restaurant with several other people as well. But during the meeting in the restaurant, that's where you really have the sparks flying between Hilmi's brother, Wasim, and Liat feels very, very outnumbered because everyone else at this meal is Arab or Palestinian or partly Palestinian, and she is the only Jew and the only Israeli. Before I get to that part of the restaurant scene, I just want to show you what a good writer I think Dorit is when she is being descriptive, because she describes, before the people start talking to each other, the scene in the restaurant. So I just want to read one short passage. The waiters, all wearing colorful kaftans, carry our endless pitchers of sangria and bottles of wine. Then, in a vibrant, aromatic parade of cinnamon, ginger, chili, and saffron, they approach with the conical clay tangines of lamb and fish and steaming platters of couscous and pastilla, which they set down before us to the sound of cheers and hungry murmurs. So that made me hungry just reading that passage all over again. And I do like the way she describes things. You'll see if you read the book, and I hope you will, a lot of descriptions of places in nature, of New York City, of mountains, and it's quite good. So what happens in the book is that Hilmi's brother, her lover's brother, really goes after her, I think, in a very, very big way. He says to her, oh, of course I can't find the page right now, but he says to her, you Israelis are all the same. So that really smarts when you hear something like that, because we've all had a situation where someone says, you Jews are all the same. And when you group of people like that, it's hard. It's very, very hard. And he goes on and on. Then he says to her, you Israelis, do you know what your problem is? And Liat says, the narrator, until now, he'd avoided looking at me over the course of the evening, his eyes wandering around to other people. Then he says, you live in denial. That's your problem. You refuse to accept the fact that in the not so distant future, you will be a minority in the land. He rolls a toothpick back and forth with his tongue, and every so often he chews and sucks on it. Now, I love that little introduction of the toothpick, which is not necessary for the scene or for the political, but she makes several references to the toothpick. So she has a really good eye for small details. Wasim goes on to say to her, you work so hard to push Palestinian history out of your consciousness that you can't see ahead anymore. You're in denial of what is bound to happen in the next 30 or 40 years. Now, I think we may all have heard this ultimate issue for Israel is that there are going to be eventually so many Arabs in Israel and on the West Bank, and how can we govern all them? And well, would we become South Africa again, where a small group of whites is ruling a group of blacks? And that's certainly where Wasim is coming from. He says, as I mentioned before, if we look at simple logic, at demographics alone, it seems that as early as 2020, now this book was written in 2014, it seems as early as 2020, less than 20 years from now, both populations are expected to be equal in size. So he keeps making this argument, and she has a hard time. She's having a hard time. She's listening. She doesn't want to insult her lover's brother, but she says to him, even the most moderate Israelis, the most sober ones, who are willing to make any compromise and any concession for peace, to withdraw from everywhere, that kind of talk from our point of view is, and then he interrupts her. He then goes on to say that the trend is now irreversible. Irreversible? I exclaim furiously, and they all look at me. Do you think? But Wasim charges on without letting me interrupt. And irreversible as 40 years of military control and violent oppression. So this conversation becomes, of course, very, very political. And I wanted to just jump to one more thing, and I think Dorit has really captured here a very, very liberal Israeli. Liat obviously is not a Likudnik. She doesn't follow Bibi Netanyahu. She's a very liberal person, but even she is having a very hard time, and they're not listening very much to her. So she probably makes a mistake. Here's what she says. How can we, a democratic Jewish minority and a majority of Muslim Arabs, be sure that a catastrophe like the Holocaust won't happen again? And as soon as she says the word Holocaust, immediately Wasim says, oh, here we go, and immediately starts criticizing her for bringing the Holocaust into the conversation. So I could go on and on and read some of these other passages from this section, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of the flavor of this very, very tense and serious conversation that happens at the restaurant, and how devastated Liat, the narrator, is, because no one is coming to her defense, including her boyfriend, Hilmi. He's not interrupting or in any way challenging his brother, nor is anybody else who was at the table. So I just think that Dorit has done an excellent job here in capturing what the arguments are presented by the Palestinians and what the Israeli arguments would be back. And of course, there is no resolution. There wasn't a resolution when she wrote the book. There's no resolution today, but I really do appreciate her trying to get into the head of the different parties here. So that's one scene that I really thought was extremely well written, and I'm going to pass it back to Ethan. Oh, by the way, I should say one more thing. Some of you may have questions or comments, which we would love to hear, but we ask you to wait till the end so we can try to get all of our points in. Ethan, please.
Yeah, I'll just also give a kind of example and contextualize some stuff, and then try to leave a good like 20 minutes for questions from people, whether you've read the book or not. And if there's a positive questions, Joel, I know Joel and I have other passages to go to. But I think just going off of, just to give you another point that should have mentioned, the book was published in 2014. It's set in 2002, 2003 in New York. So it's New York, very post 9/11 New York. That's a big thing. If anyone remembers or lived there, I lived there at the time, so it's very easy to identify. But she also, as Joel mentioned, great at evoking the sort of the look and feel of New York, particularly kind of like the West Village where a lot of Israelis congregate. And so, of course, that's also the Intifada, the second Intifada going on in Israel and the West Bank. So they're meeting during this time that back home things are very, very bad. And it's also interesting, though, that like those kind of explicitly political moments, they really, so that's on page like 160, it's in the 160s. the two of them go quite out of their way to not have those conversations. So like, it's definitely not a book that's trying to stage those over and over, which is kind of what gives that scene that Jill read a lot of dramatic, velocity when you come upon it. And I would also say, yes, she's certainly not right wing, but I don't know if she's particularly left wing either. I think she's very kind of an every woman. I think the author does a great job of showing the blind spots of a person who takes themselves to be quite liberal, or maybe not even quite, but, takes themselves to be an open-minded person. Obviously, she meets this guy and wants to keep seeing him. So she's not, terrified of that, though it comes up. But a place where I think her blind spots, the scene I want to read, come through in an interesting way. And this will be, we can decide how much we want to spoil it. But on page 20, 25, and 26, she's talking about, this is their first encounter, and they're walking around the West Village. Where do you live? And she's, like, I live in Tel Aviv, and my apartment has a view of the ocean, and that really impresses him, that she can see, the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. She's surprised that he can't swim, because in her imagination, as with most Israelis, they live close to the water. The water is such a big part of, the vast majority of the population lives along the coast. And so you live in this place, how can you not swim? And what she doesn't realize is that for Palestinians, and this is a really big issue amongst Palestinians, is the idea that he lives in Ramallah, 40 minutes from the sea. From certain vantage points, you can see the sea, but he's not allowed to enter Israel proper. And so, like, for many Palestinians, they born, live, and die and never see the Mediterranean. And so on the top of page 26, she says, or the end of 25, he's saying, I'm from Hebron, there's no sea there. Then we moved to Ramallah, there isn't one there either. Yes, but what about Gaza? My voice came out high-pitched and awkward. You guys have a sea in Gaza. He laughed wearily. The sea in Gaza? Then he enumerated all the ways the IDF made it difficult to get from the West Bank to the Gaza Strip. The permits, the months of waiting. Me, ever since I was a kid, he said, and it seemed as though he could scarcely believe it himself. I've been to the sea only 3 times my whole life. And so then she gets embarrassed and realizes that she, didn't think about that ahead of time. And he says, "Nu, come on." He held out his hand with half a smile. I'm not going to throw you into the sea because of it. Let's go. And then they walk for a bit and he says, but one day you'll know, he went on in surprisingly high spirits. One day it'll be everyone's sea and we'll learn how to swim in it together. He's in some ways probably maybe the more optimistic. He's definitely not supposed to be kind of like the everyman of the Palestinians. And she, by choosing to narrate it from her vantage point, we have a lot more of what's going on in her head between the dialogue. Oh, I said this, that was the wrong thing. Oh, is he mad, or should I say this? Whereas with him, we just sort of have the way he presents himself to her, and he's very charming and he's very romantic. So that's interesting. And it's extra interesting. Joel, I'll leave it to you. Should we tell them the end of the book?
No. That really would be too much of a spoiler, I think.
Too much of a spoiler. We won't tell you the end, but it when you get there, if you haven't, you'll know why I picked that scene. Yeah. So this Romeo and Juliet thing, and I think that's maybe one last thing. I would say like 90% of the sentences in this book have no politics in them. They're about the romance, they're about what it's like to fall in love and what it's like to, learn about another person and their pursuits and whatever. But there are these moments where the narrator is aware, maybe not that the book would get banned, but there are some organizations in Israel, some of whom are actually tied to Naftali Bennett's personally, and Ayelet Shaked, his former political partner, that there's an organization called Lahava that has this big publicity campaign about like the Arabs are trying to marry your daughters, kind of protect your daughters. And the narrator remembers hearing a radio advertisement for this group, like, watch out, they're trying to take your daughters. And it plays in her head and she thinks, when I heard it, it was crazy, but she's constantly reevaluating where she stands on this issue of cross-national romance and if it's doomed and if it can happen, and also knows that back in Israel it would be received very differently. It's this thing that's warned against, even though it happens extraordinarily rarely. So I feel like we could, Jill, if you're open to it, we can start taking questions, or we could say other things.
I want to just read one more short passage, because again, I think I mentioned before, this is a love affair. It's a love story. There is some politics involved, of course, between Arab and Israeli, but she also just writes so beautifully. And for those of you, which is probably many people online, who have been to Tel Aviv and who love Tel Aviv, I just want to read one passage where she has now left New York and is back in Tel Aviv. This is I may have a different edition than you do, Ethan. I think some of the pages don't match up. But anyway, on page 222, towards the end of the book, she says, as she's walking around, lofty, laid back, languid Tel Aviv. Now, some of the credit, I'm sure, has to go to the translator here, but still, I'm going to give Dorit most of the credit. With its 1,000 coffee shops, always hopping, and numerous breeds of dogs on leashes, with baby strollers and bicycle riders, benches and glorious ficus-lined green boulevards, treetops casting shadows on the lines of cars and mopeds, florid, self-absorbed Tel Aviv, reflected in the display windows of designer stores, the city that embodies hedonistic lust and lively turmoil, where summer vacation fills the streets with young men and women, tourists and vacationers speaking English, French, and German. Tel Aviv of the midday rush on hummus and shawarma stands, of early evening iced coffee and cold beer. Sweet, indolent Tel Aviv of open balconies and juice stands, of gelaterias and convenience stores on every corner. Sweaty Tel Aviv, sighing with relief in the twilight hours and blushing in the honeyed light of sunset. So I really like that, and I think gives you a real flavor of what it's like in the middle of Tel Aviv, bustling people all around, coffee shops on every corner. Okay, so we would like now to open it up for any questions or comments, as long as it's just one caveat, please. We don't want to have any political arguments here on who's right or wrong with the Israelis and the Palestinians, but we would love to hear anything, especially anyone who has read the book. We'd love to hear any comments or questions. So unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question.
Well, why don't we have people raise their hand and then we'll call on them.
Oh, okay.
A little bit easier that way. But Mike Ozer had his hand up first, so let's call on him.
Okay, great. Mike, go ahead.
Unmute yourself.
I thought one thing that I thought was interesting was how Liat could sort of suspend time, the time that she was in New York, as though this wasn't really what was going to happen in the end, and because she wasn't in Israel. And so there was this distinction between being away, that she could do things, she could have this love affair, she could, time was sort of suspended. I think in one part of the book, it was either she or it was referred to as sort of ephemeral. New York meaning that you could we could do what we want and it'll all be over whenever we get back to Israel and the Palestinian territories or something like that. It wouldn't, once she got back to Israel, everything would be different. I thought that was just an interesting
Yes,
way she looked at things.
yes, I felt the same way. Comments on that, Ethan?
Yeah, I just, this voices, she hears her sister's voice in her head a lot of like, what would the family say? And in both directions, not just her family like judging her, but sometimes her sister is like making fun of her, like, oh, are you gonna tell them about every like hummus place you've ever eaten in Jaffa just to show that like you get it, So yeah, I think that the book is very invested in what becomes possible in these diasporas, that the other brother lives in Berlin. I think Dorit Rabinyan lived in Berlin after New York. And these are pretty huge communities of Israelis in these places. And certainly not every one of them is going to go down, and I think there's something very unique about these two individuals, that they're open to this experience. Even in New York, it's not the standard experience probably for most Israelis and Palestinians there. But yeah, I mean, the book is she's very, I think, because again, we have access to her thoughts and not his. We hear about all of her, well, can this really last? Can this last here? Can this, probably definitely not last there, right? They physically, legally can't even, wouldn't in that time wouldn't have been able, and now wouldn't be able to see each other unless they met at like a checkpoint. So yeah, that's an interesting dynamic.
Julie had her hand up next.
Hi there, can you hear me? I'm on my headset. Yeah. So this is a great program and also a great book. I've flown through it over the last 4 days, and I'm an English teacher as well as a book group facilitator. So I was super interested in the topic. And I'm definitely going to pitch it to all of my book groups. I brought it up with my students yesterday, but my question is for you, and I don't know that anyone will be able to answer both questions. I don't know enough about Hebrew and how it works, or certainly I don't know about Farsi and how it works. I was struck, as was Joel, by the language, which is absolutely, it's transcendent. It's really, really beautiful. And I'm sure part of that has to do with her writing, but I'm guessing the other part of that has to do with the way those two languages work. Are you able to address that?
I'm going to let the professor answer that one. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's tricky because so it's originally written in Hebrew, but they're supposed to be speaking in English. Like when they're in New York, they're speaking English. He doesn't speak Hebrew, she doesn't speak Arabic, but for a few words. So it's actually probably easier for us to read the translation. And I think Jessica Cohen, the translator, gets a lot of credit, and she's a very well-regarded translator of Israeli literature. It's translated Edgar Keret and some others. So yeah, but there's a little bit of Farsi in there, but like basically it's supposed to be that when they're speaking to one another, like pretty much all the dialogue in the novel is supposed to be happening in English, which is how that's what happened. Palestinians in the West Bank don't learn Hebrew, in distinction from Palestinians in Israel proper. So they have these jokes and they have some footnotes. And those are also in the Hebrew edition, where there's like, if he says something in Arabic that she wants it to be the reader to read the sounds, it'll be transliterated, and then there'll be like a footnote saying, explaining what he said or something. I don't know if that answers the question.
Not exactly. The question, I understand that when they're in dialogue in New York and they're speaking English, I'm definitely not talking about that. I'm talking about when Liat is describing what she sees, what she hears, what she tastes, what she experiences. That to me is clearly in her thoughts in Hebrew, and the translator has moved it into English, and yes, did a phenomenal job. But I can't help but think that it has something to do with the way that Hebrew functions as a language. Does that make more sense?
Okay, it does. It's a very tricky question, and this kind of like a $1 million question in translation. I think that it isn't that particular kind of lyrical descriptive style, I think is equally possible in both languages, like in Hebrew and in English, but like, you know, I don't know, Hebrew writers might arrive at it differently. I could do the super academic thing and say, you know, Faulkner influenced Yehoshua and Yehoshua influences this, and so it actually comes from English originally. But I don't know, you know, that would be like such a great question to ask Dorit when she comes, because it's kind of a signature of this book is these really lyrical, like what Joel read about the Tel Aviv, and there's a bunch of those, you know, for New York as well. There's really long lyrical paragraphs. Is there something unique to Hebrew that allows her to do that, or is that just kind of her creative genius outside of language? So yeah, we're going to start calling on people, I think, is what we were told to do. And I think
Rabbi Shasta is going to call on people. So.
Oh, okay.
I just told him that if he want, this is a behind the scenes moment. I just said to Ethan that if he wanted to, because you guys are doing the conversation, I'd be happy to stop moderating, but I'm happy to if that'd be helpful, whatever you want.
Yes, please.
Okay, Elisa, your turn to go next, and then Lori.
Thank you. I've been listening to all this discussion about the language and the descriptiveness, and I agree, she writes beautiful descriptions, and that they all seem to be, primarily they're from the point of view of Liat. But I really felt reading this book that you get more into the depth of Hilmi. You know, he's thoughtful and he's creative and he's deep and he doesn't shy away from conversations or from hard situations. And he's a lovely, lovely character. And I felt emotionally that you really get closer to him than to her, where you hear from her what's going on and what's happening, and you know, the descriptions of things, but not so much you know, her soul and what she is about personally. And I mean, maybe that's because she's writing from her point of view, and this is a person that she loves, and she in some way is painting a portrait of this artist. But I'm kind of curious whether you or others had that same feeling as you read through the book.
Joel, it's your turn.
No, I thought Hilmi was a wonderful character and beautifully portrayed, and obviously from the point of view of somebody who is in love. So I think Dorit maybe said this is how Liat might talk about him. For those of you who haven't read it yet, he's an artist and he gains some good recognition, and he just seems like an absolutely wonderful and loving and caring and very sensitive person, although they do get into some fights like any other couple does. But I agree that she has made him into a very loving character, and sometimes maybe even a little more than Liat, who sometimes just comes across as neurotic. But I believe that you've hit a good point there about her portrayal of Hilmi. And the one thing in the passage that I read from the meal at the restaurant where Hilmi's brother is attacking her, he doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't object. He doesn't try to protect her, and that leads to a rift between the two of them. But no more spoilers.
But he also protects his family, right? He is sensitive, as you said. I wondered whether maybe some of the banning, one of them, there are probably multiple reasons, but also could have been that he is in some ways a more sympathetic character than she is. And that could be hard, given the matzav.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, obviously, for Israelis to view Palestinians in general, and Hilmi is this kind of a person as, you know, regular people just like us, and they're not some kind of second-class citizen or second-class person, and can have all the attributes that you might want in a lover. Okay, do we have another question?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Joel, and everyone else, Ethan. I thought the book was beautiful and very difficult. And it was kind of like an island in time, you know, the island of Manhattan, like the only place where they really could come together. And her perspective that, you know, she imagined him growing up, you know, kind of like in a bomb shelter or in the rubble or in a terrorist family. Like it was very interesting how it showed what her biases were and how he didn't necessarily fit those biases. And I felt like it was a little bit more sympathetic to the Palestinian side than the Israeli side. On the other hand, I kind of reflecting on what Elisa said, he was an artist. And so I think if she really wanted to go public with the relationship and perhaps live with him in his garden home, I think he could have done it because he was an innovative, creative type. But I saw her a little bit differently. I saw her thinking about the real practicalities of it, not just the politics, but cooking beside her mother-in-law in Ramallah, you know, him being in their boisterous home on Friday night. Like there just was no way to bridge it. And not to give anything away, but you know, that I felt like the ending sort of had to end the way it did. I don't think there was any other, I don't think she had any other options, but it was also a little bit, I don't know, maybe too easy.
Maybe just make a quick bridge comment here. And this is, I don't think it's a spoiler because on the title page, there's a dedication to a person. And she wrote in The Guardian in 2003 or something, a letter to a real person, a real Palestinian man who she had an affair with. And so you can kind of look up Dorit, Rabinyan, The Guardian, and find out how much of this is based on real events. But yeah, I mean, even just you're talking about being in the kitchen in Shabbat. I mean, it would like be legally not possible for them to get together, like they full stop. And I think going back to the previous comment that and I do Dorit will probably elaborate about this, whether she's more sympathetic or he's more sympathetic. I think there's also the thing of like the lover and the beloved. Like inevitably, you're going to sort of see the beloved in, you know, through the rose-colored glasses, when no matter their nationality, if it's a love story about from one to the second person. But that humanization is maybe potentially what's so threatening, is like the concept of the, you know, I mean, Jill said it really well. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else have a question, comment?
Yeah, Annette.
Annette.
Hi. I was I'm only about 60 pages into this book, but I thought something that was so interesting was that, you know, it begins with her being you know, interviewed by the FBI, and because of the way she looks, that I think she's identified in the cafe as a dark person. And then when she meets Hilmi, you know, they have this discussion about, you know, has this never happened to you before? I get mistaken for, you know, people of color, basically Pakistani. I'm looking for the part where they said, and Hilmi even says that he gets mistaken for being Israeli. And people have tried to speak to him in Hebrew. And she also, I think at one point refers to when she was a little girl and had some interaction with an Arab little girl who didn't realize that she wasn't Arab, you know. And I kind of, it's interesting how, you know, there's other cultures where people aren't supposed to interact, obviously, other interracial linkings. And in this case, you know, they can walk around New York and nobody's going to look at them in a funny way because they both are dark. They could both be the same. You know, it just, something about that really struck me, and that I felt that if they were in Israel, it would be somehow it becomes much more obvious, you know, the difference between them. So it's just interesting that they both could pass in a way for one another. So it's not really a question, but it was just something I was thinking about.
No, it's a good comment. Thank you very much, Annette.
Rebecca, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask something?
Now, what I wanted to say something, but I'm a little worried that it's giving a little bit too much of the book. I read it in 2016, so I don't remember it very well, but I kind of remember, what I remember from it is this very fatalistic feeling that sort of goes through the whole story, where, you know, a little bit like Michael said, they take these little islands of time out of time, but you know, at least for me, as someone who grew up in Israel, you have this feeling that it's going in a certain direction. And just, you know, the whole business with the sea, with the ocean, the beach, that later comes back. It's almost like, you know, seeing the person who falls under the train in the beginning of Anna Karenina, and then, you know, it resurfaces again at the very end somehow. So it sort of felt to me like a very fatalistic kind of trip through time.
Yeah, it's interesting. My own comment is that I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about whether, you know, that what her message was. Is it Israelis and Palestinians can get along? What can we do to stop all this mutual prejudice? Because here's these two people who are in love and they have so much in common as they realize it, or is the message the opposite? Israelis and Palestinians really can never get along. So I don't know that either one of those is really the ultimate message in the book, but you could take both parts of that, or both sides of that, as you read and as you think about the book.
I don't see any more questions. Terry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Ethan.
Oh, I got a message that maybe Eddie was trying to raise his hand but couldn't do it. I don't know, Eddie, if you had a question or a comment.
You know, it was interesting. She seemed to be much more concerned about the appearance of the relationship, particularly among her family. Hilmi seemed to be more comfortable with having her and having her know his family and the like. She seemed to be very sensitive about not sharing with her family, except maybe with her sister, what was going on in her relationship. I don't know whether she felt she would be judged for that or not. It also seemed that there was a timetable for the relationship, and yet, you know, there was no effort to say, let's stay in New York longer, let's go live in Berlin together, let's go somewhere else. And they seemed to think it seemed to set the stage for a relationship in time, for a certain period of time, that made me feel like no one ever thought there was a future.
That's powerful. I think it seems like a few people are picking up on that kind of on that sense. I don't want to say more beyond that for spoiler reasons, but I think it's a great comment. And are there any others, just as we kind of probably are about our time? Any other comments or thoughts people want to share?
Well, we want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and we also want to wish everybody Shana Tova U'Metuka, have a wonderful Rosh Hashanah. And once again, giving the pitch, please, we hope that everybody on this Zoom and everybody who you know, please tell about our weekend, because I think it was really being very, very interesting to everybody to hear in person from Dorit, and all the questions that have been asked tonight, which I think are extremely good questions. What a great opportunity to ask them personally to Dorit, and I'm sure she'll be interested in hearing your views. So thanks very much, and we'll see you the weekend of October 28th.
Shana Tova, everyone.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.